Florida. There's a very good journalism school there. I got into that school. I did want to be a journalist. I won't hide that part. But at the University of Florida, you had to take a certain amount of courses to get into upper division of anything, education, economics. And I just was one of those, I wanted to take everything, which I did. So the only college that would take me was journalism. So by my senior year, we could all check out Bell and Howell's, if you remember those little cameras. And I was taking demonstration videos at the University of Florida against the Vietnam War and selling them to a Jacksonville television station. That was my first foray. And then I graduated. Those final months at the University of Florida were a little stressful because they finally would bring out, here's what you can expect to make as a journalist. And it was like, why didn't you tell me this in the beginning? So there was that. And then when I graduated, it was about a 6-month wait. I applied for everything everywhere. And I was just about to take a job as selling rental cars for Hertz. I often think, had I taken that path, I might be the vice president of Hertz by now. But nevertheless, ABC, a new affiliate in Orlando, gave me a chance. Many of the other companies in Orlando at the time would say to me when I would walk in, we don't hire women in the newsroom, dear. Illegal to say, but they said it anyway. And ABC felt that they needed a woman. They had a woman. She was a banker, and neither one of us understood this. They only needed one. So once they got a journalism graduate, they fired the other one. And this was, I was an affirmative action hire. There was another affirmative action hire. He was the Black reporter, and they paired us every day because nobody else wanted to talk to us in the newsroom because we were aardvarks. We were different. We were not like the rest of them. And they didn't really like us barging into their club. They were mean. When I was on the air live, they would take their pants off often, just see how I would react. It was a trial by fire. It was really a terrible time to break into the business. I could see what was happening in New York. By that time, I could see Connie Chung. I could see Leslie Stahl. I knew that women were being hired for these jobs. But, the South was behind. And so by the time, like 2 years in, I could see that every TV station in my market in Orlando had a woman. They all, the times were changing and they changed along with it. They just didn't treat us very well. And I remember thinking, is this my fault? Did I not learn something in college that I need to know? I just couldn't wrap my head around the idea that this was just simply because I was a woman and I had barged into an all males club and they didn't like it. And back then they couldn't really touch us. There was no Harvey Weinsteins around. But they could be as aggressively hostile as they wanted. And management would always say, oh, can't you take a joke? So, I went to grad school for a teeny bit of time to learn broadcast management. Somehow I felt that if I knew that, people would stop taking their pants off in front of me. I mean, I just couldn't put two and two together back then. I just couldn't. How could they not like me? I'm nice. I did city council meetings. I did school board meetings. That's the bread and butter of local news. That's what people want to know. And how you worked as a team is, in the morning, you shot for the correspondent. In the afternoon, they shot for you. That's how it worked. So you had to know how to operate a camera, and you had to put up your own sticks, and you had to know how to, because this was film, you had to know, digital came way after I was out of the business. You had to know how to reload a film canister on the street, which meant a big black bag and gloves. But I learned how to do it because I had to learn how to do it. And it wasn't a bad skill because we also had to cut our own stories. So you had to cut film when you came back.
And it was amazing too, that you had to get it back as quick as you could to get it in the soup early. Yeah. So that your film got out of the soup first. So you had to have time to edit it if you wanted to be the lead story.
Yeah, correct. You had to get it in the soup. You're completely right. So that was your deadline, not the broadcast that night. And then the other thing you had to do is you had to go to the art department to talk to them about the graphics that were going to go behind the anchor guy. And I remember doing a story about people getting kicked out of their apartments, and I wanted a slide about retribution, and that was the word that I'd given the art department, and they came back with a slide of a godlike figure and an arrow. I said, no. This is about rent. This is about something different. But that wasn't, when I finally got to the networks, I realized there was whole departments that did that. But in local news, you pretty much had to do everything. Harassment was done from afar. I remember being on an interview and the car in front of me was all the tech, like the cameraman and the sound man, and they thought mooning me was a good idea. Taking their pants off and smushing their bums on the back window. Why they thought that was a good idea? So that's how sexual harassment revealed itself. They would never have touched me, but they certainly sent every signal that they disrespected me, that they thought I was a lesser human being, that they could get away with that behavior, that they felt they had impunity to do it, that management wouldn't do anything about it. That was all true. That was certainly all true. And so a lot of this, you just had to suck it up. You had to be as tough as they were. You had to, because you were in the car with them all day. You went and ate lunch with them, and it wasn't pleasant. It wasn't. But you just had to grin and bear it, because there was really nothing else to be done. I was very happy when it all subsided. And then aged out of the groping targets, which I was happy that had happened, because we had that. We had that at NPR. We had guys who would take out young producers and, for God knows whatever reason, put their tongue, down a throat. And you think, why would you do that? What was that? And that was about power. That's what that was. That wasn't sexual. That was about power. But I missed that. Thank God I did. There was a moment that my electricity kept getting turned off, and I thought, why is this happening? And so I called up the power company and I said, why do you keep turning off my electricity? I'm paying my bills. And she looked at the paperwork and she said, someone named Hemline has put in orders for your electricity to be turned off. I thought, you would do that? You would do something for somebody called Hemline? But that was the harassment. There were groups of people in the South who just were not happy about us, invading a male space. And many years later, I was working at ABC, and there was a young woman, Korean American, who came to my office. And as these things happened, she said, can I talk to you about how you started? And I said, yeah, sure. She said, what was your first job? And I said, well, I was an affirmative action hire. And I see her and she's thinking about that and thinking about that. And she says to me, what were you? And I realized that in her head, the idea that a woman would be an affirmative action hire was incomprehensible to her, because that's just not how it worked anymore. And this was 30 years later. So I can see why it hadn't occurred to her that there was a time when we couldn't get jobs. There was nothing set. And so if you're good at judging opportunity, which is really what you have to be as a journalist anyway, then you can see one when it hits you in the face, and you go that way or wherever the opportunity is. If you don't have a set plan, I'm going to do this by the time I'm 30, and then by the time I'm 40, I'm going to do that. We didn't have that. We didn't have that template. We didn't know what we could do. I think they didn't understand anything that I did. And there are days when I think they were a teeny bit afraid of me. Well, I came from a family, here, what they call them here at Princeton are flies, first generation low income. And, my parents while they became professionals and they managed to navigate themselves into the middle class, that was great for my brother and my sister, but that's not the family I grew up in. We were, and so nobody had done anything like I was doing. And my first job, I was a producer, so they never saw me, so they didn't even know what I was doing. They loved when I was on TV because they got that. That was perfect. And but anytime I was on, I would call them and tell them, and they would call me and go, "Did you get a new coat? Did you get a haircut?" And so I realized they had no idea. They had no idea what I was doing. And when I got a Neiman Fellowship in '91, my father didn't say, "Congratulations." He said, "How the hell did you get into Harvard?" And I think it was very honest of him, because I think that was really what he thought. Like, I don't get any of this. Like, who are you? You know? First war is 1982. I had just, gotten sort of a producership. I wasn't a correspondent, but I was sent as the producer on what would have been my first war. Israelis invade Lebanon. We arrive about 4 weeks after it begins, and I stay for 3 more months, and I'm producing. So it's my first war. We go from Cyprus in an old rickety boat to Beirut, and some little guy who's working on the boat says, "Oh, you can have my bunk." What I didn't realize is he was going to open the door, close the door behind him, and chase me around the room. The only good news was I was bigger, which doesn't happen very often, and I just got out of there as fast as I could. But that was another thing that I hadn't counted on. Oh, there's that. That happens when you're a female in a place like that. We got to Beirut. I noticed that there were people water skiing as we docked in Junia, and I thought, what kind of war is this? And didn't understand that there were different parts of Beirut. There was the west side of Beirut. That's where the war was, which you could see while you were having dinner. And so what happens when you show up in a war zone, in your first one, and especially on a story like that, where there's tons and tons of correspondence, your learning curve is pretty quick, and you figure out who you can depend on, who you need to ask. And if you survive it, your company takes note that you figured out how to do it. And so they send you back. And so my career as a war correspondent really was because I survived the first one. That was the big test. And since I did, I got to do it some more. And often I was the only woman on those assignments. I paired with a very tall, very blonde Swedish correspondent from Swedish radio, Agneta Romberg. And we were a hilarious pair, great big Agneta and little me. But we bonded over radio because when you speak Swedish, there's not many people you can interview in that language. So she had to use English. So our hall from every day was interchangeable. And so that was a second lesson about, covering wars. You make alliances. It's usually with other women, because you can trust them, and they're in the same boat you are, and you understand each other, and that's how you get through it. So in the early days, a lot of us, that's how we managed it. We just made alliances and worked together all the time. And to be very honest about this, it also kept you sane. The therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder it's called the talking therapy. You just talk it and talk it and talk it until you're bored to death with it, and it recedes into your long-term memory. So if you've got a colleague every day, that's all you do. You just talk all day. We're women, so we talk all day. And so, not only did you have a news partner, you also had somebody who could keep you on an even keel. The alternative was sitting in the bar with all the guys and getting drunk, which was not an alternative. this was a better way to be able to get through an assignment that can last for 2 months. I was in Beirut for a long time, and it was extremely stressful and dangerous. And it helped that there were other women correspondents who were there. Now, many war correspondents are female. Certainly in the Middle East, they are. There's a moment that goes from me being on the radio in Iraq to me going to TV, because that was my progression. And I will never forget sitting in a C-130 flying somewhere. And I have a light around my head. I have my computer here. We are editing together. And I look across and I see there is a TV correspondent, and she has her hair in hot rollers. And I think, really? On a C-130? But of course, she had to do that because she had to look decent when she got off the plane. By the time I got to network television, I did have help. I mean, those makeup people were everywhere. But boy, they commented on your clothing, they commented on your weight, they commented on your haircut, they commented on your makeup. You were under the looking glass all the time. And it was a real shock coming out of radio, where nobody cared, because they don't have to, about how I was what I wore, I had to learn all that in my 10 years at ABC. But, you had plenty of people who were in the same boat you were. So there were people you could talk to about it. It wasn't an insurmountable problem, but you did have to think about it. And you also understood that your sell-by date was much sooner in television than it was ever going to be in radio, or certainly in academia. Boy, that clock ticks and it gets louder and louder. Women out first. After 50, you're lucky to hang on to your job, and they'll try all kinds of tricks to get you out, but they just don't like it when we reach a certain age. They really don't. You have more time in radio, you have more time in academia, but it happens everywhere. Women who are interested in doing this kind of work married what I call portable husbands, guys who were willing to move. And that was the secret for many of them, where their husbands had a way to make a living in Beirut or Damascus or Istanbul or Riyadh. And it was a joint care for the kids. And I remember so well being in Baghdad with Kelly McEvers, who had a kid in Istanbul, and her husband was taking care of the kid. Every day at 5 o'clock, off she'd go. The door would close and I could hear through the wall, up, down, up, down. I knew exactly what she was doing. That was the kid. That was her 2-year-old. And she was doing the things that you do with little kids. And then an hour would be up, out she'd come, and she was back to doing Baghdad news. But I think that is what happened. The other interesting pattern that I see is my generation of foreign correspondents quit when they had their kids. Christiane Amanpour came off the road when she had her son. Women left the field when they had their children. Now they don't. They really don't. Our male Berlin correspondent's got 2 kids. Our female in Beirut has 2 kids. Our female in Dubai for NPR has 2 kids. And they don't do what I did, which is go off for a month or 6 weeks. They go for much shorter terms because they need to be back for their kids. And the offices think that's perfectly fine. I had a partner who did the same thing. He worked for NBC. I met him in Beirut. And so that was helpful to have yet another companion that I could talk it out. The truth of war corresponding and why people do it is that you see the worst of humanity. That will not surprise you. But you also see the best of humanity, and that is always a surprise. When you get to a basement of doctors who are performing surgeries by flashlight, and these days it's by their iPhones, you're always like, whew, you don't even live here. And you find, I used to have a thing in my head when I arrived somewhere like Sudan. I would say, who would I be? I hope. There was no test to this. So I would pick some real heroes and think, yeah, I would have been that. But, you find like some woman who's who's been a housewife her whole life, who organizes an entire stadium of refugees to get them fed. Did she know how to do that before this? No, but she just does it. And it takes all of her skill and all of her knowledge to figure it out, but she does. And so I think I would have been her. I hope so. I hope so. Because it's always impressive when you see it. And I do think that's why people stay. I mean, look, it's not as soul killing as you might think. It's just exhausting. And there is a moment where you think, can I still run that fast? No. Can I get enough sleep to make sure that I can do this all day? Not as much as I used to be able to do. So there is a moment where you think, you know what? If I got killed, every one of my friends would say she should have known better. And that would be true, because I do know better. And, you know, here's the thing, every time a journalist gets killed in the field, that's what we all say to each other. I wouldn't have done that. They should have known better. And most of the time they do, not all the time. So yeah, it's, you know, I realized that it was time for me to stop doing that kind of thing. Lots of people at NPR. It was more a collective than it was a newsroom. And we had all kinds of different skills. And NPR back then used to send us to Senderfrei's Berlin. I went to 3 workshops there because they were the best in the world. You know, NPR was new. Nobody had really had a whole lot of ideas how to do this. You know, the best we could do was, back then, we all would have listening parties and listen to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because it was audio and, you know, it had a narrative. But the Germans were doing things like the Bells of Europe, where they would go around and record in stereo all these church bells. And the premise of the show was Europe melts its bells down in wartime and recasts them as bells in peacetime. That's all it was, but it was beautiful. And they did another one about a motorcycle gang where they brought 12 motorcycles on the Philharmonic stage, mic'd them all. And the opening of the show was vroom, 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 all 12. And it was like, oh my God, you can do this? This is fabulous. And so NPR would send us there to figure out how to do this. They had tracking booths. And tracking booths, this is something that you know when you're in the radio business. A tracking booth, you have to match your audio. So if you recorded everything outside, you need a booth that sounds like outside. Otherwise, you'll sound like you're in the bathroom, and it doesn't work. It's too boomy, it's too noisy. And the Germans had a room that matched every piece of audio you could think of. A dry room, a wet room, an outdoor room. And probably the most formative training that I had was at Senderfrei's Berlin. Who, you know, these are people who still had ribbon recordings from 1944 when the Allies bombed Berlin. They were recording on Nagras, you know, still today, the best recorders that they are, with these beautiful microphones that the Germans made, which I have. I mean, all of my microphones are German. And so it was the best training that you could possibly have. There's training now. There are people called host whisperers, and they come in and they tell you how to pause, right? Because otherwise you'll go really fast and you won't stop, and then no one can understand you. So it's better to take a breath and then go on. You have to sing your track. It's the same process. It's the same pausing. It's the same rhythm. I can write a 45-second, you know, news piece, and I'll practice it 5, 6, 7 times. I don't get it right. Even now, I need to know what every word is. I need to know where the emphasis is. I need to know where to pause, and I can't get it in my head and my ears until I've written it and I read it a couple times, and then I'm comfortable enough and I can start. I know I have to be, you know, declarative at the top, and then I can soften, but, you know, it comes over time. It really does come over time. And the thing is, now I realize is I talk like this all the time because it's easier to do that than find whatever voice I may have had before I trained myself to do this. But you listen enough and you can figure out how to do it. And, you know, NPR is not known for its gorgeous voices, like anybody can get on the radio, but everybody learns what I'm telling you, this idea of you have to sing your track. You have to sound like you're talking
Very
and not reading. And that is a skill in itself. And we all have to learn it. Competition, I would say not until I got to ABC. And then it was fierce and not pleasant. In the radio, I could do whatever I wanted. If I could think it up, I could do it. You know, it was an amazing time. I went to Egypt. I mean, we did documentaries. I did a 90-minute documentary on the tapes that Jim Jones recorded in Jonestown, including the White Knight at the end. Somebody dumped 500 hours of audio tape at NPR, who he'd gotten through a FOIA, a Freedom of Information application. And nobody knew what to do with it. So they said, oh, there's a new girl, give it to her. So I got 500 hours of Jonestown audio. And it was my job to figure out what to do with it, which I did. I figured out how to make a 90-minute program, and we did. And there was 5 of us who did it. Nobody was competing. I think we had a couple of fights, but not so. Public radio, no. I mean, the pay was terrible, but you could do whatever you wanted. So that competitiveness, television was a whole different business. You know, ABC was notorious for the competitiveness of Roone Arledge, who, when I got there, was the head. And the other thing that was happening in TV at the time when I got into it is it was so rich. There was so much money. I was in the Gulf War in 1991, and Peter Jennings must have been an NPR listener, came to my door at the Daron Hotel and said, "Are you Deb Amos?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "It's too bad you're not blonde." And I said, "What?" That's TV. And I should have known. And of course, when I look back, I know that there was a reason that he said that. And that was going to be part of what I was going to have to deal with in TV. Roone Arledge was known to send 2 crews out to the same story and pick the best one. I mean, that happened at ABC. And it was awful when those things happened. I came at a moment, it was the high point, I think, when I walked in the door. They tripled my salary. It was quite attractive to go to TV. In the first 6 months, though, I said, it's not enough. It's not enough. I hate this. I didn't like it. I didn't fit. I'm not a visual person. You know, the rules of that game were pretty much middle of the road, you know, no big people, no small people, no dark people, no old people. And like that wasn't it didn't have anything to do with NPR. So I was a fish out of what? I was just a fish out of water. But, you know, I lasted for 10 years, and I have to thank Saddam Hussein. He saved me because the second Gulf War, our chief correspondent at the time, I got to TV. We didn't do anything. I was in Turkey for 4 months, but we never crossed the border. And then ABC said, "Okay, you have to go home." I said, "What? Are you kidding?" So I called NPR, and Annie Garrels was off to write a book about the Gulf War. She'd been there all the way up. I said, do you need somebody? And Lauren Jenkins, the foreign editor, said, "Can you go in 2 weeks?" And I went, "Yeah, I can." So I did. And I did. And ABC, I didn't tell them. I just went. And they heard me on the radio. And when I got back, they had thrown everything out of my office. I mean, they were mad, but there was nothing they could do. Sorry, I'm done. That's where I'm going. That's my mental health. I need to go and work for those people. I can't work for you guys. I don't like this enough. So that's how I got back to radio. I teach journalism at Princeton in the fall, and I've been doing that. I started in 2012. I came back in 2016, and I've been here ever since. I left NPR in the end of April of this year. They fired 20% of us. They're in a terrible budget crisis. I tried to quit, but I think they wanted to fire us because then you got severance. And I hadn't thought about that. I thought, oh, you're right. Better to have severance. And in the spring, I'm going to go teach at Bard Berlin for 14 weeks, something I've this will be new for me. I'm going from a student body of 5,000 to a student body of 500. Many of them refugees. I teach migration reporting, but I also covered, the Syrian war crimes trials for 2 years, even all the way through COVID. So I just got a generous research budget from a school here to write, maybe academically, maybe a book. I don't think we've all decided what, on this Nuremberg moment in Europe where people are saying we need accountability for what Russia did to Ukraine. Perhaps we should have an international war crimes tribunal, perhaps something like Nuremberg. There's no consensus for that. There was earlier in the war, but I don't think there is now. And so what I'm following is I've moved from the atrocity beat to the accountability beat. That's what I care about now. I feel very much like, I read a book recently. It's called The Trial of Kaiser Wilhelm. Well, that trial never happened because right at the end of the war, the Dutch gave him asylum, and he lived in the Netherlands until 1941. He was 82 years old. And already by that time, the Nazis were in the Netherlands again for World War II. And it was the beginning of my decision that I was going to assign myself the accountability beat and see if I could make a meal out of it. And so that's pretty much what I've been pursuing. So I'm as busy as I have ever been. Here's what's very strange here at Princeton. Most of my students are females. We don't have males sign up for journalism. I don't understand it. We all scratch our heads about it. It seems to not have anything to do with who is teaching, but it's mostly young women. And I'm delighted to see them. It just makes me scratch my head about what's going on with these guys. Why don't they want to do this? I take them on trips. So 3 times we go to Canada. This is my 2nd time to Berlin. You have no idea how you bond on a trip like that. Because you're with them all day and some of the night, because they don't come in till 3 o'clock in the morning. But you do bond with them. And they, I'm a journalist. I've been one my whole life. So when they call me and they're working this, they know I know. And I can give them some, real advice that's useful. I wish I'd had somebody like that. What's odd about teaching undergraduates is half the class knows everything about journalism and the other half of the class has never done it. This is not a journalism school. This is different. It's in the humanities department. So I take a poll in the beginning of the class. Who's here because they want to be a journalist? Who's here because they want to go to Berlin? And they're different hands. And I think, if you were clever, you would say both, but they don't. They don't. They're too honest for that. And so with some of them, I have to teach what's a lead. They don't know. They've read them all their lives, but they don't know it has a name. What's a source? What's an analytical piece? Last year, I assigned, you have to write an analytical news piece. Well, they thought, I was shocked by this, they thought they had to analyze it. I said, no, that's not what we do. We do not do that ourselves. We call up people and we ask them questions and that we put that in our piece. That's what we do. Or last week, I had 2 students who did this. They didn't understand how quotes worked. They didn't understand that if you just put quotes and say he or she said, I will know that you did the interview. So they made up a fake news site and tied the quotes to that. And I said, why did you do that? And they said, well, we didn't want to get into the piece. We didn't want to be a big presence in the piece. I said, what, how would that have happened? Well, then I would have to say, I talked to him and I didn't want to do that. So I made up a news site. I was like, oh my, I have a lot of work to do here. So they're kind of funny and these are the ones who don't work for the student newspaper because they learned it there. And these are the ones who just come in, they're physics majors or their math or their English, and they don't know nothing about what we do. And I'm always finding the depths of what they don't know. But because journalism is a convention, we know there's certain things that you have to do. You have to first name and last name and first reference, last name only after. They all want to call everybody by their first names. That takes 2 classes to beat that out of them. So the little TV I watch, which I don't watch very much, everything's short. And the other option that you have is everybody's a talking head. So there is no reporting. It's all opinion. I've stopped watching all of that. I realized how anxious it was making me, because what I now say is, I just want to know the news. Leave it to me to figure out how to feel about it. I do not need your help to tell me how I must feel about these things. And so there's so much of that on television that you can hardly go to sleep at night, because it makes you so anxious. So I just don't watch any of it. I read it all day long, but I don't watch it because television has changed that much. And honestly, I listen to 2 radios, BBC and NPR. That's it. I suppose I could bring the CBC into this mix, and I've been known to do that, but that's 2, it's enough. I don't listen to any local radio, and they took news off the air decades ago. I probably stayed too long in war zones, because what you realize is, after a while, that news is so cyclical. All the people who covered Ukraine in 2014 would have had to take a long vacation to wait for the next round when people would call on them. Some of them stayed through the whole thing. Some of them now, I look at their copy and I can tell who was there in 2014 and who wasn't. And so I often think that perhaps I would have been wiser to broaden my patch a little bit. It's really hard to get out of something that people identify you with. You really have to work hard at it. I know a lot of the correspondents who've been in China for 10, 12 years. It's like, I have to get out of here. Otherwise, I'm never going to get out of here. I speak Chinese. They know that. And so they try like hell to, and it's not easy. It's really not easy to change your beat. They don't like it. You're in a slot, you stay in that slot. And that's why I've broken out now, when I finally feel a little free to do it, and have the means and the backup to do it, is to change to this beat. I learned it when I was covering the Syrian trials in Germany. I learned about universal jurisdiction. I learned what you have to do to get a war crimes tribunal. I learned about sovereign immunity. I learned a lot of law covering those trials for 2 years. So when Ukraine came along, it was like, yes, I can do this because I get it. I understand it. And all the people who were doing Syria pivoted to Ukraine. And so I did too. And I think that is, I should have done that earlier. I should have, I don't know if I could have. I probably couldn't have. They knew that they could call me up in the middle of the night and say, get on a plane, and I would probably land in Damascus. And I was dependable, and I just got old enough and tired enough of it that I said, I'm not doing that anymore. I am not going to those places anymore. I'm going to do this. And so that was me. That was me finally making a change. You watch your colleagues and people spin out at 40, spin out at 50, get thrown out. Ultimately, you do. But the fact that I've kept my job, kept my head down, did my work, I didn't fly too high and I didn't fly too low. It's a good place to be in journalism. And it wasn't that I picked it that way. It must be just me. But I just kind of, kept my own counsel, did my thing, tried not to bother anybody, stayed on the road, because I always think, you'll like me better if I'm far away, which was correct. And to be able to then do this teaching, and especially at a place that, talk about imposter syndrome, the idea of me teaching at Princeton is just hilarious. I was a bad student. I went to a state school, but I was an okay journalist. So, so that tells me, okay, I did something right. And here I am. And I'm still able to operate, and I'm pretty pleased with that. Teaching at Bard Berlin, I'm a little nervous about it, but I pulled it off. And all my friends said, how'd you do that? I said, I don't know. I just did. So I think that's its longevity is the thing.